going to be talking about 8 relationships that you must master to fulfill your destiny. 8 relationships that you must master to fulfill your destiny. 8 different types of relationships that you must master to fulfill your destiny. And we are going to be looking from the life of the Apostle Paul. The life of the Apostle Paul, arguably the second greatest Christian after Jesus Christ. 8 relationships that you must master. 8 different types that you must master to fulfill your destiny. Now, many of you know the Apostle Paul wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. He's one of the most prolific writers of the Bible, one of the most influential saints. And we're going to be looking out of the book of 2 Timothy. Now, just by a little historical background for many of you, you probably know this, but 2 Timothy was his last book. It was his last words. It was the book that he wrote it was the book that he wrote before he died. And he wrote it from prison. And he's reflecting on his life. And it's very, very profound because you would think someone who is as prolific as Paul, as he sits there and reflects on his life, he may have reflected on the letters that he wrote or his conversion. He had a supernatural conversion. For some people, he may have they reflect on the mistakes they made. Paul made many mistakes. But it's very fascinating of all the things that Paul could have thought about, or is clearly the theme in his last moments. The theme that he was reflecting on was the relationships he encountered in his journey. The relationships he encountered in his journey. So I want to encourage you to look at 2 Timothy chapter 4 on your own. 2 Timothy, the whole book on your own, but I want you to particularly focus on chapter 4, and we're going to look at it momentarily. But it's deep because as he reflects on these relationships, he's very honest about them. You know, we live in a world where it's very fashionable to be super spiritual about our relationships, and it's rare. It's rare that you'll hear a Christian be really raw about their relationships. It's almost like we feel obligated that everything's fine and there's no problems and we get along with everyone and everyone's marriage is fine and no one has any strife or anything. But Paul didn't come across like that. He was very clear about who these relationships were with, and more importantly, how they impacted him. And before we go any further, the key message, as I take you through the 8 different types of relationships that you have to master to fulfill your destiny, the key point that I want to give you right from the jump is Paul teaches us and shows us how to maximize the benefits from the right relationships and how to minimize the toxicity from the wrong ones. Paul never presented his life as though he didn't have any wrong relationships or any strained relationships or any relationships that were difficult. And what's exceptionally profound about his message is as he's reflecting, the lion's share of these relationships, both the positive ones and the super negative ones, were with other believers. Hello? Other saints, church folks, people that you'll be spending eternity with in heaven. Lord have mercy. You ever have an encounter with someone and you wish that they weren't going to be your neighbor in heaven? In fact, in this last chapter alone, in chapter 4, and you can count them, he mentions 18 different people. In the last chapter of Romans chapter 16, I believe he mentions 37 different people. In other words, if Paul was on Facebook, he would have more friends than all of us combined, or more people. Let me change that. He would have more acquaintances. Paul was a people person. Now, you have to keep in mind, we have email, we have cell phone, we text, we can pick up the landline for those of you who still use that. Paul maintained these relationships without any of the technological advances. And what's the point? He made an effort to maintain these relationships. Really, his letters were his effort to stay connected. Paul didn't love you and leave you. And the thing about Paul that's so profound when you read about him is, if Paul got you born again, and this is convicting to me, if Paul got you born again, he kept following up with you. You read in Acts, he would write things like he went back to so-and-so to strengthen the church. And he would go back to so-and-so to follow up with the believers. And he wanted to make sure that they weren't in a backslidden state, or they weren't in a state where perhaps they were denying the original truth. He worked real hard at these relationships. And here's the key. Many of them were not always positive. His life really teaches us and shows us that it's very difficult to go through life caring for people and not be scarred in some degree. You don't have to be a victim, because the key is, as you read through these letters, Paul never comes across as a victim, but he comes across as someone who's very, very honest about his interpersonal dynamics. And I said this before, and I'm going to keep saying it. For me personally, much of my brokenness or hurt that I've experienced has come from people. Consequently, much of my healing will come from people. Now, let's not get it twisted. We talk about Jehovah Rapha. He's the God who heals and mends stitch by stitch. But God's given us our spiritual family so that people can be God in flesh. Churches who are heavy on the word, but not heavy on people, are depriving the members of a source of healing that God designed. If they're heavy on the word, no one loves the word more than me. But what I'm sharing with you is taking me years, if not decades, to come to the realization of. If we're heavy on the word, but we're not as heavy on people or one another or spiritual family, we're depriving ourselves of one of the primary mechanisms that God created for us to heal. You're going to read about a man named Onesiphorus, I believe. I'm not pronouncing his name right, but you can't pronounce it either, so you can't correct me. But it tells us, and we'll read about it, he says, he often refreshed me. And this is deep. It says, he often refreshed me. And then it says, and he wasn't ashamed of my chains. Now, he could have been talking about real chains because Paul was in prison. But what does a chain symbolize? A chain symbolize bondage. In other words, this gentleman, whose name that I'm not going to pronounce too often, you'll read about it, Paul was saying, here's a cat who wasn't ashamed about my bondages. In other words, many of us have bondages. Many of us have things that are trying to incarcerate us. Many of us have things that are work in progress. But this guy, he wasn't ashamed about it. In other words, he said, you know what, Paul, you don't have to be super spiritual. Don't get spooky pooky with me. I know you wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. I'm not ashamed of the things you're struggling with. I can be a safe person. So we want to realize that much of our hurt has come from people, and much of our healing. I was in a situation, can't give the specifics of it, where a person that I had invested a lot in hurt me deeply. And if I had not concurrently had people that I invested a lot in supporting me, it would have been very difficult to go through that process. So we want to talk about this issue of relationships. Likewise, when you've been hurt, you're going to have to grieve it. And you've heard me talk about grieving. What's grieving? It's metabolizing experiences. It's processing them. But listen to me carefully. You've heard me talk about grieving enough, you can probably finish my sentences. But I haven't said what I'm about to say before. If you're grieving over a situation in isolation, you're depriving yourself of part of the healing process that God wants to give you. In other words, He designed it so you should grieve in community, so that you should feel the love or the warmth or affection or sympathy. Sometimes, isn't it amazing what just a tiny bit of sympathy can do? When someone says, I feel you, I get it. Now, I understand. In fact, this is a sidebar, but when you read through the gospel, it says Jesus was moved with compassion. 5 times that preceded his miracles. It's amazing what a little sympathy can do. You don't want to enable people, But it's amazing what someone, just how liberating it can be when someone says, you know what, you have the right to feel that way. If I was in that circumstance and someone treated me like that, I understand, I get it. So if you're grieving in isolation over a relationship, over lost money, over time that's gone by, if you're grieving in isolation, you're depriving yourself. I'm depriving yourself. And this is tough for leaders because leaders aren't allowed to show weakness. This is tough for men because men aren't allowed to show weakness. A good friend of mine is going through a very difficult marriage situation. He's going through a divorce. And one of the things that we talked about is what makes it so hard on him is women will go through the divorce and go through the grieving process in community, but most men that I've talked to do it in isolation. I can think of a guy right now who told me that he was divorced 6 months before he told anybody.